everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and this time you made me watch an episode of Deadliest Warrior. This is kind of an odd, off-the-beaten-path request, and this one was requested by Carl Maxey on Patreon. Thanks very much to you. Usually I do scripted stuff on this show, of course, story-driven things, be it for movies or TV shows. This time I'm having to tackle a reality show or kind of a documentary, pseudo-educational sensationalist kind of thing. This is a show that aired on Spike TV in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and I remember seeing advertising for this when it came out, but never sat down and watched it. This kind of thing was never really my bag, and at the time, I kind of stayed away from a lot of reality programming. I was still kind of missing scripted television and, narrative dramatized stuff. And it felt like we were just starting to get out of that period where most channels were making almost nothing but reality stuff in order to cut costs, and these days it's very much the opposite of that. It seems like we're just inundated with serialized scripted television, a lot of stuff that is too much of a big time commitment for people to watch, too many of these things, even if they're binging, and it's just a very different time these days, and not a time I ever thought I would see again. When in the mid-2000s, it seemed like, your Biggest Losers and shows like that had really taken over the airwaves, and it was very difficult to get real, thoughtful, thought-provoking fiction on television, and I was really missing that, and it was kind of a be careful what you wish for situation, because now there's way too much of it, and I can't keep up, and I never know what's really, worth watching and stuff, and so I'm really, kind of overwhelmed these days with television, and this was kind of that transition period just a couple of years before we get into streaming television, which really changed everything. But this show is interesting because I just watched one episode of it, and it's interesting because it's kind of in my mind, prototype for a lot of the kinds of things that you would see later made by independent companies and individuals on YouTube. It's like some of the reality programming, and again, this kind of pseudo-documentary stuff that you were seeing at this period is the same kind of thing that later would switch over to just folks in their basement making things, which is part of the reason I think that you ended up with so much scripted stuff later, because the technology got a lot cheaper and the resources were just easier to get your hands on. And so these days, it's pretty easy for people to make stuff that looks like this with these kinds of production values or even better. And I mean, Spike TV's original programming, it felt like it was, it took like $5.50 to make. It was, by the way, if you're not familiar with that channel, and I think that's still around, or maybe it's under a different name now, I'm not sure, because I don't keep up with broadcast anymore. I watch, exclusively on-demand stuff now. But in the early 2000s, when it started, it was a all male driven channel. It was trying to compete with some of those all female demographic networks like Oxygen and things like that, where it's like, well, there are these channels that are with programming aimed exclusively at women. What if we did it with programming aimed exclusively at men? And it started with a lot of Star Trek reruns. They got their hands on reruns for Next Generation, and then later they were doing with other Star Trek shows, and amusingly, Voyager was in there, even though that show was aimed arguably just as much at women as it was men. Really odd programming on that network, but when they had original stuff, the production values looked like stuff on the Sci-Fi Channel or worse. And my biggest, complaint watching this show is the reenactments are really pretty terrible, and if it were possible, I would have suggested, change that to just animation. Basically, what this show will do is it takes two groups in history and says who would win in a fight between them. One of my least or one of the topics that I have always been least interested in. Who would win in a fight between this and that? Batman and Superman, or Godzilla versus King Kong. Although that movie was really quite good. But these are things that don't immediately make me rush off to a movie theater and watch something, or want to click on a YouTube video. I just have, at the risk of sounding kind of pretentious, I've just always been a lot more interested in more like thoughtful, more intellectual kinds of questions. And I think part of it too is, I love silly, over the top, goofy stuff too. But I think these kinds of things have just always been too theoretical to me. There's too many variables. It's like, who wins in a fight between, with the show I had to watch for today, Vikings and Samurais. Okay, well, like, what exact particular period are we talking about, like, within the histories of those two groups, and how many of them are there, and how, well trained are they versus other sects of them, or whatever. Like, there's a lot of potential variables, and the show is pretty generalized. I would say that I learned a little bit about some of the weaponry and stuff that I didn't know anything about, but not a lot about the culture. The focus is, of course, really, honed in on the violence and the strategies of these particular groups, and their like physical ability and such. And it's a good, if you're going to ask this question, and this, like I said, there were 3 seasons, there were 33 different pairings, 33 different pairings that were done in this show. This is an interesting one because, as the narrator talks about in the episode, they certainly are kind of opposites in the way they think, and in their strategies. So with the samurai, you have people with an honor code, and who are really strategic, and who really plan ahead, and they're kind of playing chess, and they're all about accuracy, and it's brute force with the Vikings, and they don't have an honor code. They'll do whatever it takes to win, and that kind of thing, and that shows very much in their weaponry. But I didn't learn a lot about the cultures of these two groups, and for in 45-minute episode, an hour 45 minutes with commercials, it might have been nice to get a little bit more about the actual backgrounds about these groups, instead of what you might just read in the first couple paragraphs of a Wikipedia page. And that's very much what this looked like. The most fun thing and the most worthwhile thing in this show is the kind of Mythbusters component to it. And that's really what this is. It's trying to not debunk something through experiments, but trying to prove for sure who might win in a fight between these two groups by using their weapons against like dummies and things, and seeing what kind of damage they would really cause. And then also running simulations in a computer with all of the variables as we understand them. And I think that is a really good idea. We don't really get to, we have, like I said, reenactments in this show, and they're pretty lame, and they're laughable. Some really bad kind of CG matte paintings, for lack of a better term, in the background, and costumes that look like it came out of the high school thespian closet. So, I don't know, that stuff wasn't really worth my time, but it also didn't take up too much of the episode. So when you get to the end, you get, I mean, the longest of those is right at the end, where it's like we're waiting this whole time to finally see a battle. And by the time we get to that, I feel like I've already kind of seen the battle, and I already have a good sense of how exactly it's going to go, because of all of the details in the experiments. We get to see, like, a katana versus versus an axe, and several other weapons between these two groups. and how they tear into flesh, and how their defensive weapons work. So, if somebody's not wearing any armor at all, a katana, pretty obviously is going to slice right through flesh, and you're not going to have any problem, killing a man very quickly and easily. But what if he's wearing chainmail? And if you're just watching and you let it wash over you, and you're not thinking, you're not like using, the knowledge that you have already, you're just kind of, taking it, totally as it's giving it to you. You're like, oh, that's really interesting. The chainmail makes it really hard for a sword to go through, and then you think, oh yeah, I knew that already. Like, duh. And I had that a little bit with this, where at first I'm like, oh, that's an interesting point, and then I'm like, wait a minute, no, I knew that already. And shows like this always make me feel like I'm losing brain cells a little bit, where it will kind of suck you in a little bit, and then you'll kind of forget that you already brought knowledge with you, because that's what broadcast television kind of does to people a little bit. But anyway, like I said, one of the more interesting ideas was, let's have a computer run 1,000 simulations, and then the winner is gonna be whichever won the most matches. So it isn't just based on a singular theoretical match. I just wish that somehow those computer simulations could have been dramatized physically, outside of just seeing a bunch of people in costumes that look like they're at a Renaissance fair doing one battle. And I don't know exactly how you would have done that. Again, maybe an animation somehow. But I thought it was a good idea anyway to do that. There's just not any really visual component to that, and you're watching a TV show. I'm going to give this a real lukewarm. I'm feeling it. This is not really my cup of tea. I don't watch a lot of these versus things on YouTube, the who would win in a fight between this or this kind of thing. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would while I was watching it, so that's why I flipped green, but I don't think enough that it would make me want to go back and watch a lot more of these. Maybe I would check out one or two of the pairings that I find most interesting theoretically. If it was streaming somewhere, I had to pay a couple bucks to watch this episode, which was fine for this, but I don't think I'm compelled enough to go in and pay, $2 for each of these that I would want to see. And the thing, like I said, that was most interesting about it to me was just seeing where we were during this transition period, where you don't have as much of this kind of stuff on TV anymore because you don't need it. You've got people on YouTube making this kind of stuff, and I'm sure there still is some of this sort of thing because it's really cheap to produce, but it's not gonna bring in the kind of viewership that it once did. And I don't know how well this show did. I mean, well enough to be on for 3 seasons. Well enough that I remember hearing about it a little bit. I think it got a couple of video games. It was a thing for a while that some people were certainly watching. But I was surprised that it came up, and Carl, thanks a lot for having me watch it. I'm not expecting a lot of people to watch this video, but thanks a lot for tuning in if you did. I thought this might be our first chance to get something closer to 0 views, because I don't know how much interest there is in this or me talking about this kind of thing, but I like challenge, and I like getting outside of my wheelhouse a little bit and doing something unusual. Like I said, usually I'm talking about scripted stuff, and occasionally I'll do a documentary, but this is this weird kind of in-between thing. So anyway, thanks again to Carl for suggesting it and asking me to talk about it. And if you would like to request something on Patreon for me to talk off the cuff like this about either a movie or a miniseries or a comic run, usually I'll do, I say comic run, usually I'll do an arc or a graphic novel or a miniseries, and I also do, like with this, an episode or two of a TV show. You can go to patreon.com/geekvolution, pardon me, it's late, and you can join the $15 tier. You can do that for just 1 month, and that will get you in the queue, or you can stick around there. I am going to have to take off here in a couple of months when my twins are born, and so there'll be a delay after that, but I'll still have all of the requests lined up, and I will get to them eventually. I'm gonna try to knock out a few of them at least before I go on hiatus. But I just wanted to let everybody know what was going on with that, and that it will take a little bit longer if you make a request right now, certainly. But I am still taking them unless it gets real out of hand, and hopefully I'll only be out for 2 or 3 months before I can start at least doing occasional requests again. Thanks a lot for watching, folks. See you again real soon. I was Captain Logan, and have a good one. Later, folks.